Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. I bear witness that no one deserves to be worshipped except Allah Ta'ala, the one who has no partner and no similar, the one who has no length and no width and no depth and no perimeter, the one who's not a volume and is not in a place. And how could he be in a place when he existed before time and space? He created everything except himself, including you and your actions. Nothing occurs except by his will, both good and bad, he destined to happen. He speaks without sound, letter, or language, not Arabic, Hebrew, nor Korean. He's not light. He's not a spirit. He has nothing in common with human beings. He's not in the direction of up, down, right, left, front, nor back. And whatever you imagine in your mind, Allah is different than that. And I bear witness that our noble, unrivaled Master Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the slave of Allah, his final messenger, and the best of all of God's creations. May Allah unite us with him in paradise and grant us a drink from his basin. And may Allah increase us in patience, humility, knowledge, and comprehension, and help us to put our knowledge into practice and grant us all sincere intentions. Ameen. We're continuing in the book, the Hadrami Introduction, Al-Muqaddimah Al-Hadramiyya, which is an introductory text in Shafi'i fiqh written by the Allama Bafadul rahimahullah. We've made it to the top of page 33 in the book. We've made it where? To the top of page 33 in the book. We're in the section of the book that's talking about the things which are recommended to do in the salat, the things which are sunnah to do in the salat. And I remind you that the topic of discussion here is fiqh. In the science of fiqh, when we use the word sunnah, we mean, it doesn't mean something that the Prophet used to do, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, necessarily. It might mean that, or it might not mean that. When in the science of fiqh, when we say something is sunnah, we mean this is something that you are rewarded for doing, but there's no threat of punishment if you don't do it. To put it in normal, regular English, we're talking about things that are optional. Things that you should do, things that you are encouraged to do, things that you are recommended to do, because these things get you reward. And these things bring you spiritually closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these things can improve your state as a Muslim. So these things are good to do. But if you choose not to do them, there will not be any punishment for that. It's not haram if you leave these things out. The validity of your salat doesn't depend on these things. The previous chapter, which listed out 13 things that must be done in order for your salat to be valid, those things are the obligations that you have to do. These things we're talking about in this chapter are optional things, things that you don't have to do, but you should make every effort to do. When we ended the class last week, we had begun talking about one of the sunnahs of salat, which is to recite some Quran after you say the Fatiha. So in the Shafi'i school, you're going to say the Fatiha at the beginning of every rak'ah. And after you finish the Fatiha, and after you say Ameen, saying Ameen is also a sunnah, it's not required, but it's optional. After you say Ameen, it is sunnah to recite more Quran after the Fatiha, to recite something that's not the Fatiha after the Fatiha. We started this topic last week, so we're going to start it again now. I'm reading from the bottom of page 32, where it says, it is recommended to recite some of the Quran after Al-Fatiha other than Al-Fatiha. So one of the sunnahs of salat is after you say Surah Al-Fatiha, that you then say some more Quran, something which is not Surah Al-Fatiha, something else from the Quran. Okay, even if it's just one verse, even if it's just one ayah, it's sunnah for you to say something of the Quran after the Fatiha. And like I said, even if it's one ayah, then you will get the reward of practicing the sunnah. Like you'll be rewarded for doing this sunnah of saying some Quran after the Fatiha. However, it's better if you recite more than just one verse. Okay. In fact, in some madhabs, the minimum is 3 verses. And as I've mentioned once before, in the Shafi'i school, it's always recommended for you to do something that gets you out of a difference of opinion. Meaning it's recommended to do things in a way that all of the scholars agree is acceptable, rather than doing something in a way where some scholars say it's acceptable and some say it's not. You don't want to be stuck in a difference of opinion like that. So the fact that some madhabs say the minimum is 3 ayahs, it's definitely better for you to say 3 ayahs rather than 1. But the ruling of the Shafi'i madhab is that if you recite 1 ayah, you are practicing this sunnah. But what would be better than saying 1 ayah or even 3 ayahs? Saying more than that. Let's keep reading. The author, may Allah have mercy on him, says it's sunnah to recite some of the Quran after the Fatiha other than the Fatiha. When? When do you do this? Do you do this every time you say the Fatiha? No. When is it sunnah for you to recite more Quran? It says in a subh prayer. Who here remembers what a subh is? Subh is another name for al-fajr. And you'll find that in the books of the scholars, a subh is more commonly used. The word as-subh is more commonly used than the word fajr, even though we in America, we usually say fajr. In the books of the scholars, you'll see both, but subh is more commonly used. So here, the author is saying that in a subh, okay, when you pray fajr, it's sunnah for you to recite some Quran after the Fatiha. How many rak'ahs is in the subh salat? 2 rak'ahs. So in the whole salat, meaning in both rak'ahs, it's sunnah for you to say some Quran after the Fatiha. But not just in a subh. He says, and the first 2 units of all other prayers. Okay, so every salat which is not subh, it is sunnah for you to recite some Quran after the Fatiha in the first 2 rak'ahs of the salat. Whether it's an obligatory salat like Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, and Isha, or whether it's a sunnah salat like the salats you do before and after those prayers, or even if it's like a sunnah salat that's not related to the obligatory prayers, like the nighttime prayers or the duha prayer, it's always recommended in the first 2 rak'ahs of a salat for you to say some Quran after the Fatiha. We're talking right now, though, about salats that have rak'ahs. Okay, we're not talking about janazah. Okay, no, it's not recommended to say Quran after the Fatiha in the janazah. So just to summarize here, when do you recite Quran after the Fatiha? In the first 2 rak'ahs of the salat. That's the easy way to think about it. The first 2 rak'ahs of the salat. So in subh, which only has 2 rak'ahs, you're going to do it in every rak'ah. And in the other salats, which have more than 2 rak'ahs, or have 2 rak'ahs, you're only going to recite in the first 2 rak'ahs. He says, except the follower who can hear the imam. So there's one person, for one type of person, for whom it is not sunnah to recite Quran after the Fatiha in these rak'ahs we're talking about, the first 2 rak'ahs of the salats. Who's the one for whom it's not sunnah to recite Quran after the Fatiha? That would be the person who's praying behind the imam in a salat where the imam recites out loud, like Maghrib and Isha and Subh, okay? And he can hear the imam. So if all 3 of those conditions are met, then it's not sunnah for you to recite after the Fatiha. I'm going to say those conditions again. Number 1, you're a follower, praying behind the imam. Number 2, the imam is reciting out loud. And number 3, the follower can hear the imam's recitation. When those 3 conditions are met, in that case, the sunnah for the follower is not to recite Quran, but rather the sunnah for the follower in this case is to listen attentively to the recitation of the imam. I'm going to say it again. If you're praying behind the imam in a salat where the imam recites out loud, and you can hear the imam, then the sunnah for you is to listen attentively to the imam's recitation, not for you to recite some Quran on your own after the Fatiha. This also means you should not be reciting with the imam. Okay, sometimes when a person's leading the salat, you can hear people in the ranks saying the same surah that the imam is saying, kind of saying it along with him. Do not do that. If you can hear the imam, then you need to be quiet and listen attentively. That is, of course, after you've completed saying the Fatiha. So let's go back and say it one more time, just to make sure it's clear. It's sunnah for you to recite some Quran after the Fatiha in the first 2 rak'ahs of the salats. And the person for whom it's not sunnah to say it is the one who's praying behind the imam while the imam's reciting out loud and he can hear the imam. That person listens rather than recites. Going back to the book, top of page 33, it says to recite a whole chapter is better than part of it. What does that mean? It means that reciting any amount of Quran after the Fatiha is sunnah. But it's better to recite an entire surah than it is to recite part of a surah. I'm going to say it again. It's better to recite an entire surah than it is to recite part of a surah. So if you recite a short surah, like Qul Huwallahu Ahad, that surah, which in most of your mushafs is 4 ayahs long, that's better than reciting 3 pages of Surah Al-Baqarah, which is a lot more than 4 ayahs, a lot more letters recited, despite the fact that when we recite Quran, we get reward for each letter that we pronounce. Those 3 pages of Al-Baqarah have a lot more letters, so you would think you get a lot more reward. But the ruling in the madhab is it's better to recite a full surah than a part of a surah. Even though the full surah might be shorter than the part of a surah that you're also considering reciting, it's better to recite a full surah. And a person might say, yeah, but this one has more letters in it. Yeah, well, Allah multiplies the rewards as He wills. Perhaps Allah will multiply the reward of the one who recites a full surah, such that it's more rewardable than the one who recited a lot of letters but did not recite an entire surah. He says also to elongate the recitation in the first unit. So also, as we said, it's better for you to recite a whole surah. It's also better for you to make sure that whichever amount of reciting you do in your first rak'ah, that it's longer than the amount of reciting you do in your second rak'ah. So for example, in the first rak'ah, if a person recited the surah, Wat-Tini was-Zaytun, that surah is longer than the surah, Qul Huwallahu Ahad. So you may want to recite Wat-Tini was-Zaytun in the first surah, in the first rak'ah, and then Qul Huwallahu Ahad in the second rak'ah. That way, the recitation you recited in the first rak'ah will be longer than the recitation you recite in the second rak'ah. It's sunnah to do that, to recite more in the first rak'ah than you recite in the second rak'ah. Is that clear? Inshallah, that's clear. You want to recite more in the first rak'ah than you recite in the second rak'ah. There's also another sunnah which is not mentioned in the book. I mentioned it last week, and I fear it may have confused some people. It is a separate recommendation, a separate sunnah, that whatever you recite in the first rak'ah come earlier in the Quran than whatever you recite in the second rak'ah. So it's like they're in order. So in the example I just gave, if you recite Wat-Tini was-Zaytun in the first rak'ah, well, Wat-Tini was-Zaytun comes earlier in the Quran, because that's surah number 95. And then Qul Huwallahu Ahad comes later in the Quran. That's surah number 112. So 95 comes before 112. You want to, in your salat, if you can, if you want to try to follow all the sunnahs, you want whatever you recite in the first rak'ah to be longer and earlier in the Quran than whatever you recite in the second rak'ah. You want your recitation in the second rak'ah to be shorter and later in the Quran than whatever you recited in the first rak'ah. First rak'ah should be longer and earlier. What other sunnahs do we have pertaining to this Quran recitation? The author, may Allah have mercy on him, said to read aloud. So that means there's certain places when it's sunnah for your Quran recitation to be out loud. It's sunnah for your Quran recitation to be out loud sometimes. It says, for other than the women in the presence of foreigners. What does that mean? It means that if you're a woman and there are men that will hear you if you recite out loud, if there are men that will hear you, and these men are what he calls foreigners. You know, by foreigners, he means these men are not your husband, and they're not your mahrams. They're not your relatives. They're not the people you're forbidden from marrying. That's what they mean when they say foreigner. It means someone that is not your spouse and not a mahram either. Okay, if you're a woman and you're in a place where a man who's not your spouse and not your mahram would hear you recite, if you recite out loud, then in this case, you don't recite out loud. You keep your voice low. Okay, that's what it means here when it says, as it's listing things that are recommended, it's listing things that are sunnah. It says to read out loud. It's sunnah to read out loud for other than the women in the presence of foreigners. So everybody except women in the presence of foreigners, it's sunnah for them to recite out loud. That means it's sunnah for men to recite out loud, regardless of who is around. And it's sunnah for women to recite out loud if there's only women around. And it's sunnah for women to recite out loud if the only men around are like her spouse or her mahrams. Okay, in all those cases, it's sunnah to recite out loud. The only case where you don't recite out loud is the case where you're a woman and there's a strange man able to hear if you recite out loud. Okay, but when do you recite out loud? Is it every time? Do you recite out loud in all the salats? No, he says what? In both units of a subh, so in the 2 rak'ahs of a subh, it's sunnah to recite out loud the Fatiha as well as the Quran that comes after it. It says in the first 2 units of the 2 night prayers, add the word 2. My copy doesn't say the word 2 right there, but the actual Arabic does say the word 2. So it should say in both units of a subh and the first 2 units of the 2 night prayers. Which prayers are the 2 night prayers? Maghrib and Isha are the 2 night prayers. Okay, so in the first 2 rak'ahs of Maghrib, it's sunnah for you to say the Fatiha and whatever Quran after it out loud. And in the first 2 rak'ahs of Isha, it's sunnah for you to say the Fatiha and whatever Quran comes after it out loud. And Al-Jumu'ah, the Jumu'ah prayer also, it's sunnah for the one who's leading the salat to recite the Fatiha and whatever Quran comes after it out loud. It says even after the Imam has done his salam. So if you're in an out loud salat, like say Maghrib, okay, let's say you showed up late to the Maghrib salat. When you joined the prayer, the Imam was standing up, reciting quietly. So it's the 3rd rak'ah. You joined the prayer in the 3rd rak'ah. You prayed with the Imam, and the Imam salamed out. So you stand up to do your 2nd rak'ah. Well, in Maghrib, your first 2 rak'ahs are supposed to be out loud. And so since this is your 2nd rak'ah, what should you do? You should recite out loud. When after the Imam salamed out and you stand up to pray by yourself, you should recite out loud because it's your 2nd rak'ah. So it's saying here, you recite out loud in the first 2 rak'ahs of these salats, Subh, Maghrib, Isha, Jumu'ah. Even if you came late to the salat and the Imam salamed out and you stood up to do more rak'ahs, if the rak'ah you stood up to do is either the 1st or 2nd one, then you recite out loud. When else do you recite out loud? He says, and in the 2 Eids. So the Eid prayer is another prayer where it's recommended to recite the Fatiha and whatever Quran comes after it out loud. He continues, and in the prayers of asking for rain, the Istisqa Salat, which is the rain prayer, it's a prayer you do during droughts to ask for rain. This Salat also is done out loud. And the lunar eclipse. So many of you know that if there's a solar eclipse or a lunar eclipse, it's sunnah for us to make Salat while the eclipse is happening. The lunar eclipse, which is the one that happens at nighttime, the lunar eclipse prayer is a prayer where we recite out loud. We say the Fatiha out loud, and whatever surah or whatever Quran you say after the Fatiha also out loud, which is different than the solar eclipse. When there's a solar eclipse, you do not recite out loud. You recite quietly because the solar eclipse happens during the daytime. And in the daytime, our salats are quiet, just like Dhuhr and Asr. Okay? Yes, it's true, Jumu'ah and the 2 Eids are prayed out loud, even though they're in the daytime. And the rain prayer, if it's done in the daytime, will also be out loud. But those are exceptions. Okay, the general rule is the salats that are done during the daytime are done quietly. And the salats that are done during the nighttime are done loudly. Not meaning, very loud, but meaning you recite loudly enough that if someone's right next to you, they could hear you. So what did we say so far? Which prayers are the ones you recite out loud in? We said Subh. We said Maghrib. We said Isha. We said Jumu'ah. We said the two Eids. We said the rain prayer. We said the lunar eclipse. It says, and Taraweeh. Taraweeh is another salat in which it is sunnah to recite out loud the Fatiha as well as whatever Quran you're going to recite after it. It says, and witr after it. The witr salat is a salat which it is not sunnah to recite out loud. The witr salat, it's not sunnah to recite it out loud, and it's not sunnah to recite it or to pray it in a group. Witr should be prayed by yourself, and you should keep your voice, as we're going to see a little bit later, what we call, moderate. Okay? But when witr comes after Taraweeh, which only happens during Ramadan, if the witr prayer is being done after Taraweeh, in that case, it is sunnah to do your witr in a group and to recite out loud in the salat. So this is not a normal rule for witr. This is sunnah to do in witr only in the case when it followed after Taraweeh. So if you did not go to the masjid for Taraweeh one night in Ramadan, you skipped Taraweeh, and you're at home and you decide to just pray witr, you don't do it out loud. And you don't do it in a group because it didn't follow after praying Taraweeh. Here, the author, may Allah have mercy on him, completed his list of the salats in which it's sunnah to recite out loud. He then says, and, if you want to add the word and, you can, and to be silent in other than, he says other than this, but really it should say other than these. So other than the salats that were mentioned here, the sunnah is to recite silently in the other salats. Okay, so in Dhuhr, you recite silently. In Asr, you recite silently. In Maghrib, you recite silently for the third rak'ah. In Isha, you recite silently for the third and fourth rak'ah. Okay? In Ad-Duha, you recite silently. If you pray 2 rak'ahs to greet the masjid, it's silently. If you pray the solar eclipse prayer, it's silent. If you pray 2 rak'ahs after making wudu, that's silent. If you pray 2 sunnah rak'ahs before dhuhr, or 2 after dhuhr, or 2 before subh, or 2 after maghrib, etc., these sunnah salats, these things, they're all silent. Okay, the recommendation is what? For you to recite out loud only in the salats that are mentioned in this list. For all the other salats, you recite what? Silently. He says, and to moderate in supererogatory prayers of the night, between aloud and silent. So if you're praying prayers during the night prayers, the ones that come after Isha and before Fajr, these night prayers, these optional night prayers, should you say them out loud or should you say them silently? What's famous in the madhab is that you say them between loud and silent. This is the expression that the scholars say. They say between loud and silent. But the actual scholars of the madhab, they disagree about what that means. What does it mean to say it between loud and silent? Some scholars, they understand that to mean, well, how should I put this? Before I say how they understand it, let me explain what the issue is. The definition of reciting silently is what? What's the definition of reciting silently? When we say you recite silently, what we mean is you recite loudly enough to hear yourself with your ears, but quietly enough that the person standing right next to you cannot hear you. This is what we mean when we say silently. We mean you can hear yourself, but the person next to you cannot hear you. That's called silent recitation. And when we say out loud, what do we mean when we say out loud? We mean you're reciting loudly enough that the person next to you can hear you, which means you should also be able to hear yourself. Right? But the person standing right next to you can hear you. That's called reciting out loud. And when you understand these definitions, you see that there is no in between. Right? The person right next to you, either he can hear you or he can't. There's no in between. It's a yes or no. It's binary. Okay, either he hears you or he doesn't. So if he hears you, you're reciting out loud. If he doesn't hear you, you're reciting silently. So how can you recite something that's between them when there is no between? Some scholars, the way that they understand this voice, the way that they understand this expression that you recite between loud and silently, some understand it to mean that you're actually reciting out loud, but just very low. So you're reciting loudly enough that a person next to you would be able to hear you, but a person, like 2 or 3 people down would not be able to hear you. A person like a short distance away would not hear you. Some interpret it that way. So it's as if it's in between, like being loud, like the normal loud, not very loud like shouting, but the normal loud where the whole room would be able to hear you. Something between that and the silent where the person next to you cannot hear you. Something in between there. So someone very close to you can hear you, but someone who's not very close to you would not hear you. This is how some scholars understand this expression. And I believe the translator understands it that way. That's why he translated it as to moderate between loud and silent, meaning to recite at a moderate volume, which is not very loud, not loud enough to make the whole room hear you, but, not so quiet that you're the only one who can hear them. Other scholars, they understand this to mean this expression that you recite between loud and silent. Other scholars say what they mean by that is that you alternate. You alternate between loud and silent. So in practice, it would mean you're reciting in a very low voice, such that, the person who's right next to you, he might sometimes hear you and sometimes not hear you because of how low your voice is. There'll be times when he can't hear and times when he can hear, if you imagine a person is standing right next to you. And this understanding is the one that my sheikhs preferred, that it's like alternating. You're sometimes, because no one keeps their voice at exactly the same volume all the time. There'll be points in the recitation where someone can hear you and points in the recitation where they can't, and that this is what's meant. This understanding certainly makes sense with the basic definitions of out loud and silent, which doesn't allow for anything to be between them. But the first understanding, is, I don't know how to say it. It's like they're taking a few liberties with the definition, but arrived at an understanding that makes sense. What else we got? Okay, so we're still talking about this topic of reciting Quran after the Fatiha. So far we said that it is sunnah to recite Quran after the Fatiha, as long as it's not from the Fatiha. You recite something else from the Quran after the Fatiha. And that you do that only in the first 2 rak'ahs of the salats. Okay? And we said that unless you're a woman with strange men nearby, you recite out loud in certain salats and quietly in other salats. Okay? And we mentioned that it's better to recite a whole surah than a part of a surah. Well, it turns out that it's also better to recite certain surahs over other surahs, but with conditions. So let's read this paragraph, insha'Allah ta'ala. It says also, to recite, meaning also it's sunnah, to recite. It says here the small chapters. I want everyone to cross out the word small. Cross out the word small and put short in its place. We do not ever refer to the surahs of the Quran as being small. Okay, the surahs of the Quran are great. Okay, and we would never insult them by referring to them as being small. Okay, if you want to refer to one of the short surahs in the back of the Quran, then use the word short, but don't say small. Small is like, a person might say it's as if you're belittling it by calling it small. So what he means here is it's sunnah to recite the short chapters of the oft separated. The oft separated. When he says oft separated, he means the mufassal. The mufassal. The mufassal are the surahs that are in the back of the Quran. They're called the mufassal because as you flip through the pages of the Quran, in the beginning of the book, you got to flip a whole lot of pages before you get to the next surah. Those basmalas, which separate the surahs, them basmalas are really far apart in the beginning of the Quran. When you first start flipping through the mushaf, you might get 20 pages or more in between one basmala and the next basmala. Then in the middle of the mushaf, a lot of them are about 10 pages apart. But eventually you get to a point where you get a basmala like every 3 or 4 pages, or maybe even less than that. This is called the mufassal, the oft separated, meaning those basmalas that are separating the surahs, they appear a lot. They appear often. Okay, this part of the Quran is called the mufassal. The mufassal begin with Surah Al-Hujurat. Surah Al-Hujurat. Everything from Al-Hujurat to the end of the Mus'haf, these are the mufassal. And some of the mufassal are considered to be long, and some are considered to be medium length, and some are considered to be short. The short mufassal, the short ones, begin with Surah Ad-Duha. From Ad-Duha to the end of the Mus'haf, these are considered to be the short mufassal. These are considered to be what? The short mufassal. So he's saying here that among the sunnahs is for you to recite the short mufassal in al-Maghrib. So in the Maghrib prayer, the recommendation is to recite one of the short mufassal. So you can recite Surah Wad-Duha, Wal-Layli Idha Saja. You can recite that one or any of the surahs that come after it in the first rak'ah and also in the second rak'ah. Because remember, whatever comes in the second rak'ah should be shorter than what came in the first rak'ah. So you recite from these short mufassal in which prayer? Maghrib. Now, what he's going to say next has conditions. Long story short, you should be, if you're the imam leading a group of people, you should always be reciting from the short mufassal. Okay, you should always be reciting from the short mufassal in all of the salats, whether it's, subh, dhuhr, asr, maghrib, isha. You should be reciting from the short mufassal in all of the salats. But there are certain cases when it's recommended for you to do something longer than that. What are those cases? He says, so we mentioned it's sunnah to recite the short mufassal in which prayer? In Maghrib. He says, and the longer ones, for one who is praying by himself or the imam who's leading a set number of people who are happy to do this. Okay, so we're saying that if you're praying by yourself, you know what? Let me just explain it and then we'll read it afterwards, inshallah. It'll be clear. It's like this. The sunnah is in subh for you to recite from the long mufassal, the long ones. All right, the long mufassal in subh. The long mufassal start with Surah Al-Hujurat, and it goes all the way until Surah An-Naba. So all the way until Juz Amma. So all of the mufassal that are not in Juz Amma, they're considered to be long mufassal. You want to recite a surah from the long mufassal in the first rak'ah and a surah from the long mufassal in the second rak'ah of subh. You want to recite what? From the long mufassal. Then for dhuhr, you also want to recite from the long mufassal, but you want to recite, surahs that are a little bit shorter than whatever you recited in subh. So subh, it's long mufassal. Dhuhr, it's also long mufassal, but in dhuhr a little bit less, a little bit shorter than what you recited in subh. In Asr and in Maghrib, in Asr and in Isha, you want to recite from the medium length mufassal. The medium length ones would be the ones from Surah An-Naba until Surah Al-Duha. Surah An-Naba until Surah Al-Duha. These are the medium length ones. So in Asr, you want to recite medium length ones. And in Isha also, you want to recite medium length ones. And in Maghrib, you recite short ones. This is the basic sunnah. I'm going to say it again. Long mufassal in subh and dhuhr. Medium mufassal in Asr and Isha. And then short mufassal in Maghrib. That's the sunnah. Okay? But this sunnah only applies if you're praying by yourself or if you're the imam praying in a place where every single person that's praying behind you has verbally said to you that they accept for you to recite for a long time. And you know that no one else is going to come in after you began the salat, for example. No one else is going to come in who hasn't given you verbal permission to recite for a long time. So you only follow the sunnah that I said, long mufassals in subh and dhuhr, medium mufassals in asr and isha, short mufassals in maghrib. You only follow the sunnah if you're praying by yourself or if you're the imam and you know for a fact that nobody's going to come except the people who have verbally said they accept for you to recite for a long time. Otherwise, if you're not in these situations, then you should always be reciting from the short mufassal. You should recite the short mufassal in all of the salats. If you're the imam and you cannot guarantee that nobody's going to come who didn't approve of you reciting for a long time, then you should be reciting from the short mufassal all the time. And this is because our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said to take into account the state of the people and to make it easy for them. Okay? And so if you don't know everybody that's coming in, then you don't know who's in a rush. You don't know who needs to be somewhere. You don't know who's sick. You don't know who's struggling to stand. You don't know the situations of the people. So you keep your recitation short. If you're the imam, you should always be reciting from the short mufassal in your salats. But when you're praying by yourself, feel free to follow the sunnah. Recite the long mufassal in subh and dhuhr, and the medium mufassal in asr and isha, and the short mufassal in maghrib. But if, inshallah, you ever end up being the imam of a place like the Ribat, so when I was studying in Yemen, I was studying in a city called Tarim, and many of you know that there's a school there, a famous school called Darul Mustafa, headed by Habib Umar, Hafidhullah. But also in Tarim, there's another school called Ribat. The Ribat is an Islamic school that's like on lockdown. You know, the students go in there, and then they don't come out. They just go in there and study. They're in there for like 2 years before you see them again. This building doesn't let people in and doesn't let people out. And so as a result, the imam in there knows everybody who's going to come to the salat. There's no chance that some random person is going to come in because the doors are locked. And if all the students inside gave permission, saying that they accept for the imam to recite for a long time, well, then it's okay for the imam to recite for a long time because there's no chance that someone who didn't approve might come. You understand how it works? Inshallah, it's clear now. Okay, so yes, we acknowledge that subh should have long recitation in it. That's the sunnah. But in our madhab, it's you only do that when you know everybody approves because they told you they approve. And furthermore, there's no chance someone else is going to come who didn't give approval. That's the only time you do that. MashaAllah. So now that you've heard my explanation, let's read what's in the book, and inshallah, what's in the book will be clear now. It says also to recite the short chapters of the Mufassal, the off-separated, in Al-Maghrib prayer, and the longer ones for one who is praying by himself or the imam who is leading a set number of people who are happy to do this in a subh, meaning you recite the longer Mufassal in a subh, and in a dhuhr, similar to this, meaning in dhuhr you recite also long mufassal, but not much smaller than what, or not much shorter than what you recited in subh. He says in al-asr and al-isha with the medium lengths, like the surah of Ash-Shams, which is number 91, and something similar to it. Okay, because remember, the medium length mufassal are the ones that begin with Surah An-Naba and go to Surah Ad-Duha. It says, and in the first unit of a subh on the Friday, so on Fridays, during subh, it's recommended to recite particular surahs. It says to recite the chapter of the prostration, Alif Lam Mim Sajda. There's a surah in the Quran called Surah As-Sajda. It's surah number 32. It's recommended to say this surah in the first rak'ah of subh on Fridays. And in the second one, the chapter of the human, Hal Ata Ala Al-Insani, which is surah number 76. It's sunnah to recite that one in the second rak'ah of subh on which day of the week? On Friday. And for this sunnah, it does not depend on people approving. So even if you're in the public masjid where anybody could come in, if it's subh on Friday, the sunnah is for the imam to recite Surah As-Sajda in the first rak'ah and Surah Al-Insan in the second rak'ah. This is just for Friday mornings at subh. This sunnah doesn't depend on the people approving. MashaAllah. What else is sunnah? The author, may Allah have mercy on him, says, to ask for mercy when reciting the verse which has mention of mercy. So among the sunnahs of the salat is, if you're reciting Quran and you mention a verse, if you recite a verse that mentions the mercy of Allah, or if you're listening to the Imam and the Imam recited a verse that mentions the mercy of Allah, well, then it's sunnah for you to ask for Allah's mercy when you hear those ayahs. So one of the du'as you might make is Rabbi ghfir warham wa anta khairur rahimin. This is one of the du'as you say to ask for mercy. Rabbi ghfir warham wa anta khairur rahimin. Means, my Lord, forgive and be merciful, for you are the best of the merciful ones. It's also sunnah, it says, and to ask refuge when reciting a verse about punishment. So if you recite a verse mentioning Allah's punishment, or hear the Imam recite a verse mentioning Allah's punishment, then it's sunnah for you to make a dua for Allah to protect you from his punishment. And among the du'as that are mentioned is the dua, Rabbi a'idhni min adhabik. Rabbi a'idhni min adhabik. Okay, which means, my Lord, protect me from your punishment. It's also sunnah when you hear a verse that mentions a glorification of Allah, for you to glorify Allah. Okay, so for example, if you hear such an ayah, you might say, Subhanallahi wa bihamdihi, for example, or Subhana Rabbi al-Azimi wa bihamdi, something like that. What else is sunnah in the salat? When it comes, we're still talking about sunnahs pertaining to this recitation that you're going to say after the Fatiha. This whole lesson is about this topic. Okay, what else is sunnah in the recitation? To say at the end of the chapter of the fig, which surah is that? Wattini wa zaytun. Okay, Surah 95. And the end of the chapter of resurrection, Surah Al-Qiyamah, which is Surah number 75. After you recite these surahs, when you get to the end, it's sunnah for you to say, Bala wa ana ala dhalika min ash-shahideen. Okay, so after you finish the surah, you say out loud, Bala wa ana ala dhalika min ash-shahideen. Okay, according to this metin, after both of these surahs, that's what you say. Bala wa ana ala dhalika min ash-shahideen. But what I remember being taught is we say Bala wa ana ala dhalika min ash-shahideen, what's written here, after the surah of the fig, Wattini wa zaytun. And that after Surah Al-Qiyamah, we say Bala innahu ala kulli shay'in qadir. So it's a little bit different. Bala innahu ala kulli shay'in qadir. But either are fine to say at the end of these two great surahs. Bala wa ana ala dhalika min ash-shahideen translates to, surely, and I am of those who witness to that. What else? Page 34 at the top. It says, and at the end of the chapter of the emissaries, which is Surah Al-Mursalat, which is Surah number 77. If you complete the recitation of that surah, well, then it's sunnah for you to say, Amanna billah. Amanna billah. What do you say? Amanna billah, which means we have believed in Allah. These three surahs, they end in questions. These three surahs, Surah At-Teen, Surah Al-Qiyamah, and Surah Al-Mursalat, the last ayah is a question. And so this is why we answer the question after we say these surahs. So the answer to Wattini wa Zaytun and Al-Qiyamah, the answer is Bala wa ana ala dhalika min ash-shahideen. Or if you want to say Bala innahu ala kulli shay'in qadir for Al-Qiyamah, these are answering the question. And the question at the end of Al-Mursalat, the answer is Amanna billah. We believe in Allah. The author continues, may Allah have mercy on him. The Imam does this, as does the follower. So this means everybody says it. If the Imam is reciting what Tini was Zaytun, and when he gets to the end, Alaysa Allahu bi ahkamil hakimeen, everybody says, Bala wa ana ala dhalika min ash-shahideen, out loud. The Imam says it out loud, and all of the people behind him, it's sunnah for them to say it out loud. Bala wa ana ala dhalika min ash-shahideen. But you only say it out loud if the Imam is reciting out loud. Okay, otherwise, how would you even know that the Imam recited that surah in the first place? Okay, so the followers and the Imam say it out loud when the surah was recited out loud. What's next? Another sunnah of the salat. It says to do takbir for moving. So one of the sunnahs of the salat is what? That when you shift from one position to another position, you say a takbir. How do you say a takbir? You say Allahu Akbar. Okay, Allahu Akbar. You say a takbir when you're shifting from one position to the next. He says, and to elongate it until the next pillar. So you don't just say Allahu Akbar. You stretch out saying Allahu Akbar for the entire time that you're moving. So when you're standing and you say the Fatiha and you say your surah that comes after the Fatiha, now it comes time to bow. You want to say Allahu Akbar. You want to stretch out the saying of Allahu Akbar such that you begin saying Allahu Akbar when you first start moving, and you complete saying Allahu Akbar when you are finished moving, when you're now in the next position completely. Okay, you don't want to be one of these people that just says Allahu Akbar and then bows. You want to be someone that says Allahu Akbar, like you say it while you're transitioning. Okay, this is what's meant by elongating it until the next, what's he say, until the next pillar. That's what he means by elongating it. You want to begin saying it when you first start moving, and don't stop saying it until you're done moving. Okay? Inshallah, that's understood. And what are we talking about here? We're talking about saying what? The takbir, Allahu Akbar. You want to say a takbir whenever you're moving, and you want to elongate it whenever you're moving. But there's an exception to this. He says, except when rising up. Okay. When he says when rising up, what he means is the i'tidal position. After you come out of ruku', you're going to transition to the i'tidal position. And this transition, for this transition, you don't say Allahu Akbar. For this transition, you say Sami Allahu liman hamidah. Okay, this one transition, this is the one where you don't say Allahu Akbar. Instead, you say Sami Allahu liman hamidah. But even here, you still elongate it. Sami Allahu liman hamidah. So that you're done saying it when you're in the standing position fully. MashaAllah. And by the way, everyone says Sami Allahu liman hamidah. Not just the Imam. You know, I've noticed that in a lot of communities, the Imam says Sami Allahu liman hamidah, and everyone praying behind says Rabbana wa lakal hamd. Like they don't say Sami Allahu liman hamidah. They think that's something only the Imam says. But no. The ruling of the Shafi'i school is everybody says Sami Allahu liman hamidah. The Imam says it, and then when it's time for the follower to move, the follower also says Sami Allahu liman hamidah. Okay, and the muballigh, I mean, some of you maybe have seen salats that have a muballigh. The muballigh will be a person who's in the salat. He's one of the people praying behind the imam, but he calls out in a loud voice. He like repeats the things the imam says in a loud voice because people in the back maybe can't hear the imam. So you in a big salat, you might hear, the imam might say, when he finishes reciting, Allahu Akbar, and then you'll hear someone in a loud voice call out really loud, Allahu Akbar, so that everyone knows that the imam made his takbir. And then when the imam comes out of ruku', the imam will say, Sami Allahu liman hamida, and the muballigh will also say, Sami Allahu liman hamida. Okay, this is the Shafi'i madhab. I have been to salats where the muballigh, instead of saying that, he calls out Rabbana wa lakal hamd. I don't know where they get that from. Perhaps other madhabs teach that. But the Shafi'i madhab is everyone says Sami Allahu liman hamida. The imam, the follower, the muballigh, everybody. And the translation of Sami Allahu liman hamida is Allah has heard the one who praises him. And with that, we've completed talking about the sunnahs of being in the standing position. Okay, we talked about raising your hands at the start. We talked about, the opening dua and saying, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. We talked about saying Ameen. We talked about pausing in certain places, talked about raising hands, talked about putting your hands in a certain way on your stomach, below your chest and above your navel. We talked about when to recite out loud, when to recite quietly, how much to recite after the Quran. Read all of these sunnahs we've been talking about the last couple classes were all sunnahs that you do when you're standing at the beginning of the rak'ah. Okay? We've now completed, we've said the sunnahs of that, and we've said even the sunnah of transitioning out of that position into the ruku' position. Next time, inshaAllah, we'll pick up here on page 34, and we will talk about the recommendations of ruku', the things that are recommended to do while you're bowing. And we'll continue from there, insha'Allah ta'ala. Please continue to study the previous chapter, the one that mentions the 13 things that are absolutely necessary for your salat to be valid. That chapter is far more important than these chapters we're doing now, which are about optional things. Okay, the wise person handles what's necessary before he handles what's nice to have. Okay, don't be one of these people that's so caught up trying to follow the sunnah that he leaves out the obligations. Okay, don't be one of these people that's trying so hard, to wear his thobe nicely and to have his back perfectly straight when he's bent, but he never learned to say the Fatiha correctly. Okay, the sunnah is important, but what Allah obligated you to do is far more important than what Allah gave you the option to either do or not do. So please study hard that chapter that mentioned the 13 things that are obligatory in the salat, because if you don't do those things properly, then you didn't even make a salat. And I promise you, none of us want to wake up on a day of judgment and find that we missed salats because we did them in an invalid way. Okay, none of us want that. So please, I beg you, study hard and make sure you know the obligations and focus on that first and focus on sunnahs second. That said, if you have any questions, plop them in the box. I will take a few moments now to see if I have any questions to answer. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh to those who salamed me. No questions. MashaAllah, I stunned you. Alhamdulillah. Let's say La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. لا إله إلا الله. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. Let me just say one more thing because it may not have been clear in the lesson today. When I mentioned that the sunnah is to recite from the short mufassal in all the salats, unless you're either praying by yourself or your imam and everybody approved of you reciting long. I said if you're not in one of those situations, you should be reciting from the short mufassal. That is the sunnah. But I don't mean by that it has to be from the short mufassal. Okay, reciting from the short mufassal is the sunnah. And that's what's recommended, and that's what's best for you. But the reason why that's what's best for you is because we mentioned earlier in the chapter that it's better to recite a full surah than it is to recite a part of a surah. Okay, so if you chose, for example, in Maghrib or Isha, if you're the imam of a community and people are praying behind you, if you chose to say part of, Surah Al-Rahman or Surah Al-Waqi'ah or Surah Al-Baqarah or Surah Ali Imran, whatever, if you choose to say a part of those long surahs and the part that you're reciting is no longer than one of the short mufassal, then you're still doing what's required. You're still avoiding reciting for a long time without the approval of people. Okay, so, when I say reciting from the short mufassal, what I mean is you recite from the short mufassal or something that's the same length as the short mufassal, while understanding that reciting the short mufassal is actually better, because in those cases you'd be reciting the whole surah rather than reciting part of a surah. MashaAllah. So thank you again for paying attention. May Allah bless you all, and may Allah grant those of you who are sick good health. May Allah grant those of you who are injured healing. May Allah bring relief to those of you who are suffering, insha'Allah ta'ala. And may Allah make all of us better Muslims tomorrow than we are today. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.